Good morning. I want to extend a very sincere welcome to this audience, representative of some very diverse global paces and perspectives. This panel is organized under the framework of the governance and decision-making theme of the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. Our session focuses on the role of business in facilitating cross-scale collective action on climate, and we're going to work in two parts. First, there's going to be a series of 4 short pre-recorded presentations, flash talks, that hopefully set the stage for the topic, and then we'll follow that with a panel of 4 business and sustainability practitioners whose work is really at the intersection of academia and business. So without any further ado, we're going to switch and begin with the pre-recorded flash talks.
Collective Action Challenge. There is growing recognition by global business that climate change is a significant and imminent threat to ecological systems and human well-being. This awareness is reflected in the UNGC precepts around sustainability, that is, to drive change and add value. However, the effects of climate change are multiplying and progress in climate action has been slow. At the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, Agenda 21 set out the following challenge to business. This charge has led to significant business innovation on climate. From a social science perspective, it is curiously flat. It implies that business will take on information and direction from policymakers, then make comprehensive decisions based on these initiatives, which they then communicate openly with a homogeneous public. The focus for business is on ensuring that activities within their own operations do not cause harm to the environment, i.e., it is inward facing. The goal for this talk, and really for the entire session, is to complexify this inward-facing view on the role of business in climate action. Because the challenge is infinitely more complex. As social scientists working in the areas of governance and decision-making, we would redefine the challenge in the following way. Climate change is a multi-level collective action problem requiring coordinated action within and across levels, extending from individuals to business, through NGOs, and through governmental jurisdictions at scales from the global to the local. Framing climate change as a collective action problem means that cooperative decision-making between individuals and organizations could lead to better climate outcomes, but differences and values and constraints held by stakeholders across social levels and spatial scales prevent coordinated responses to the climate challenge. This lens also makes climate change squarely a social science problem, not just a technological or biophysical challenge. It combines complex information and decision spaces where many diverse stakeholders promote and try to balance conflicting economic, social, cultural, and environmental values and objectives. And it involves stakes that are high risk and high reward. And this is particularly true for business. This figure maps out a portion of the complexity and cross-level collective action mechanisms that are important features of climate action. On the left are social and governance levels important in climate change decision-making, extending from individuals through firms, NGOs, then multiple levels of government from the municipal all the way up to the supranational. Some mechanisms of climate action occur within levels, and those are indicated here by the circular arrows. For example, businesses may identify climate targets for energy use, and NGOs may work with other transnational organizations to innovate on certification schema. But collective action at the scale required to move the needle on climate change occurs based on mechanisms that connect stakeholders up and down across these levels. So on the bottom left are strategies that groups use to level up their efforts. For example, stockholder pressure, voting, protests, lobbying, and education. On the top right are collective action mechanisms that focus downward, such as voter mobilization, incentives, penalties, or international reporting that explicitly focuses on reshaping climate narratives. In the figure's center, the starting point of each line corresponds to where specific collective action mechanisms begin based for particular groups of actors. Thicker lines reflect that particular categories of actors work across multiple levels using that mechanism. I flagged in red bottom-up and top-down mechanisms that are a focus for business. For example, business as a category spends a lot of time lobbying and advocating upward across all social levels. Alternatively, the yellow line reflects bottom-up and top-down mechanisms, where firms are the target of actions by actors at other levels. One important caveat not reflected in the figure, and I'll use the example of business here, using just one color for business lobbying suggests that lobbying at the national level is just like lobbying at the local level, but scaled up. In reality, lobbying might look extremely different at these two levels, requiring vastly different messages, skills, and organization. If your first response is, wow, there's way too much going on in this figure, that is in fact our point. Climate change is a multi-level and multi-scale collective action problem, requiring coordinated action within and across levels and scales. But differences in values and constraints held by stakeholders across these levels challenge the emergence of coordinated responses to the climate challenge. The other flash talks and video to come start from this perspective. We hope to spark an interesting conversation during the panel around such questions as, what are the insights from the social and decision sciences that could help business to catalyze collective action on climate? And in particular, thinking about what dynamics drive change or alternatively stifle cross-level action.
Hello everyone, my name is Jim Gawron.
I'm Amanda Willis.
And we are dual degree students at the University of Michigan in the Herb Institute. And we are here at the Global Climate Action Summit, where we've been talking with different stakeholders about their opinions on the role of the private sector in advancing action on climate change.
The key is to make sure that they are following through on those commitments, making sure that they are really using their power and they're leveraging their power to push forward.
Work closely with all other sectors, private sector, public sector, nonprofits, organizations.
You can't just look at private sector, you can't just look at government, you got to look at yourself as an individual. Every individual is the leader of the private sector. Your dollars are votes. Use them wisely.
Really, the solution needs to be driven by innovation and by application of capital that's coming from the private sector.
And I think the big opportunity now for the private sector is to move from a risk mentality now to looking for business value and business opportunities.
Taking action is an urgent and global priority, and we want to be a part of the solution.
Esta transformación, las empresas privadas ya deben empezar a hacer, porque caso contrario va a ser muy difícil más adelante si ellos quieren cambiar.
Triple bottom line approach where people, planet, and profits are both important.
Not just net zero, not just renewable pledges inside their company, but really pushing others to get on board to the point where companies would refuse to work with suppliers, other companies, politicians, and even consumers if they're not buying into their mission on climate action as well.
Because it's not possible for any one government or governments collectively to put the investment in that is required to bring about this transition to a low carbon economy. We're talking about $90 trillion of investment that's required.
every company can step up in the absence of policy. This is why these companies' actions can be more powerful right now, especially because there is nothing happening at the federal level. Companies themselves can step up and make this change for us in this country. Bravo to the private sector who are willing to do that work.
Like climate change, water scarcity in the American West has historically involved collective action at a variety of scales. Business owners must navigate decision-making and governance challenges with other water users who share resources ranging from individual ditches, to aquifers, to larger watersheds, to entire river basins that span state and international boundaries.
Agriculture is incredibly significant to water resources management in Arizona. Agriculture consumes up to 2/3 of the state's water demand, and it's important not only as an economic development engine for the state, but also as part of the state's cultural identity.
I'm Ronald Rayner. I farm here in the Goodyear area. I've been a farmer virtually all of my life. I've been active in water issues most of my life, as most farmers are, because you're very concerned about your source of supply.
We are facing the issues of making decisions about trade-offs about how our water is used across different sectors.
We have been working with basin states and Mexico on looking at refinement of management of the Colorado River and certainly the drought conditions that California is facing, and lower supply conditions on the and the potential for shortage on the Colorado River are influencing those negotiations.
One of the reasons we have Central Arizona Project Water is because we had critical groundwater basins in Phoenix, Tucson, and Pinal County, where groundwater levels have been drawn down over decades and decades of use. And the surface water was brought in to kind of mitigate that. And it's done a great job in Pinal County. We've seen a number of areas water levels come up over the years and stabilize.
Some areas have a very good future. Others, agriculture will disappear. We're seeing pressures from development and, of course, availability of water. If all this goes away, everything that depends on the basic production goes away as well.
You can turn the taps off to the farmers and pay them not to farm. That's basically the issue. You can't turn the taps off to the people.
Just transporting the water from the CAP aqueduct to our district lands, we're losing to evaporation and seepage just 4%. There's very little water going to waste. It's being used for crop production. It's not going down the borrow ditches. It's not being spilled into the desert. It's going to the evapotranspiration of the crop. And I think that's a message that people don't understand about what goes on in Arizona.
You don't generate water for other uses through conservation of ag water. The only real way to get water out of agriculture is to fallow land, is to stop farming it. And people have to think about that really hard. Is that what you want to do?
With what we've got in the central part of the state, I just don't see it ever going away. Will it reduce from what it is now? Probably. But I think there's some steady state down the road where we'll get to a certain level of farming. It'll probably stay that way for quite a while.
We really need to have a robust discussion about the future of irrigated agriculture relative to the other water demands, particularly those for the municipal sector and the environment.
This is my factory. I mean, this is my factory, and it's using sunlight, the soil that the roots are anchored in, and water. It's got those components. I mean, it's as basic a production model as you could ever imagine, and it truly is worth something, I think.
Water sector actors have very different temporal scales that affect their ability to collectively act. These temporal scales influence the ways problems are framed and solutions developed. If and when actors are able to come together on climate-related water issues, such as during the recent drought contingency planning efforts in Arizona, this affects social relations and also hydrological and ecological connections. Interconnections and temporal and spatial scales shape how we see the world, providing new narratives and ways of approaching challenges, such as climate change and Western water.
As the previous talks have highlighted, climate change is a multi-level collective action problem that requires coordinated action within and across levels. In my talk, I'll be sharing a framework from the decision sciences for thinking about climate change relevant decisions, and more specifically about the individual and situational factors that shape them. Models of decision making from the social and decision sciences posit decisions as stemming from the interaction of both individual and situational factors. For this talk, I will use the word individual to refer to individual firms, but this framework is flexible and can be scaled up to think about decision-making bodies like governments, or scaled down to think about individual consumers. When faced with a climate-relevant decision, a firm must identify what options are available to them and what valued outcomes are associated with those options. Data and scientific research can help firms better understand their options, and firm culture and worldviews can help firms trade off between different valued outcomes. In addition to firm-level knowledge and values, however, firms exist within a complex and multi-tiered system, as outlined in the first talk of this session. Firm-level decision-making is also influenced by situational factors stemming from these many levels, from industry-wide standards to supply chain complexity to regulations and international agreements. The social and decision sciences view behavior as stemming from the interaction of these individual and situational factors. The idea here is that the same individual firm might behave differently depending upon the situation in which it finds itself. For example, a firm might make different climate decisions depending upon the regulatory context of the state in which it is located. An important implication of this framework is that better informed decision makers don't always make better decisions on climate because they are also constrained by these situational factors. Even if a firm has comprehensive data and scientific experts to aid their climate relevant decisions, as well as a company culture that values combating climate change, they may be unable to act on climate if, for example, their desired actions are prohibitively expensive in the current regulatory environment, or if they don't have political buy-in from stakeholders. Instead, this framework suggests that another option for firms who are looking to catalyze action on climate change is to focus their attention on the situational factors that shape decision-making. Within this complex system outlined in the first talk, there exist many mechanisms through which firm decision-making influences and is influenced by decisions made on other levels. Each of these mechanisms communicates information from one level to another. For example, lobbying by firms conveys to governments the specific outcomes that firms desire. However, these mechanisms communicate more than just factual information. These mechanisms occur in situations where outcomes, like emissions, are being valued differently by decision makers on different levels. These mechanisms can reveal how different decision makers think that these outcomes should be valued. In turn, these mechanisms provide an opportunity to coordinate climate action across levels by promoting consistency in the set of values, like those that are embodied in the SDGs, that decision makers apply to their climate change relevant decisions. For example, a grocery store's choice to ban plastic bags can create a social norm amongst its customers that then extends to their usage of reusable shopping bags in other stores. Or an oil and gas company's choice to support an international climate agreement signals how that company sees its role in the narrative of what must be done to address climate change. Or a consumer goods corporation's choice to become more transparent in how it sources its ingredients signals its intentions to build a trusting relationship with its consumers. Focusing on these situational factors in terms of these mechanisms across levels and the complexity of the information and values that they convey suggests new pathways to connect levels and to foster collective action on climate. The next part of this session will be a panel discussion featuring a wonderful lineup of panelists whose vast experience building these important within and across level relationships to facilitate collective action on climate change we're very excited to learn from.
Welcome everyone to our panel. I know we've been having some technical difficulties. Actually, one of our panelists is having issues, so she's gonna connect with Jason, our tech support, and hopefully get that sorted. So thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss collective action in the business sector to address climate change. My name is Abby York. I'm an associate professor at ASU. I work on environmental governance associated with climate change, urbanization, and most recently I've begun work in the Arctic. And I'd like to briefly introduce our panel. So to begin with, Cassandra Abad is a senior managing consultant in climate resilience with ICF. She has worked on the business case for resilience and climate adaptation and led the development of many decision support tools. Tom Lyon holds the Dow Chair of Sustainable Science, Technology, and Commerce at the University of Michigan. His work uses economic analyses to explore corporate environmentalism. Ian Welsh is a business sustainability commentator and consultant with Innovation Forum in the UK, and he works on business and sustainability issues associated with fast-moving consumer goods supply chains, commodities, deforestation, and other climate-related risks, and human rights and modern slavery issues. Finally, Ben Ruddle is a professor in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems at Northern Arizona University. He's director of Fusion, which is mapping America's supply chains. So today we are gathered here to talk about the challenge of climate change and the current and potential roles that businesses play in collective action. Our esteemed panelists will focus on the frontier of decision and social science research, corporate innovations, decision support tools, and the data to facilitate collective action. I want to welcome our attendees to join us through the chat function to add questions, and our moderating team will collect those and we'll ask them to the panelists as we get going. And so to begin, I'd like us to think about how we understand and motivate corporate action. What are our assumptions and understandings on the state of decision science? And Tom, could you share insights on the challenges of scaling up corporate climate action?
Sure. Can you folks hear me?
Yes.
The technology is working. This is great. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. As you probably know, 50 years ago, Milton Friedman famously argued that the one and only social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. Now, you may not agree with that. I don't agree with that. But whether you agree with it as a normative proposition, I would suggest that as a positive description of how publicly traded firms behave, that's what we should expect and assume, because I think that's pretty much how they behave. So I want to point to two key factors that influence corporate behavior in the climate domain. One is corporate governance, and the second is public policy. And I want to give a shout out to a couple of my junior colleagues here at University of Michigan, June Lee and Andrew Wu, who have a really cool paper that just came out of Management Science that looks at the impact of the UN Global Compact membership and on whether firms actually improve their ESG behavior or not. And I will give you the very, very short summary. For publicly traded firms, no impact at all, total greenwash, nothing. But for privately traded firms, they actually improved their ESG performance by about 50%. So what Andrew and June were looking at is ESG incidents. So situations where there was public media attention of some corporate problem. And those incidents dropped by 50% after privately held firms joined the Global Compact. So the UNGC can make a big difference, but apparently only with certain types of firms, because those privately held firms have much more flexibility. So they can choose to be good actors like Patagonia, or they can choose to be bad actors like Koch Industries, and there's a huge range in between. But publicly traded firms are much more constrained by short-term profit maximization, which comes to the other thing I think we have to emphasize, and that's the role of public policy. Large corporations spend an immense amount of money on lobbying. Many people feel like they've come to capture the regulatory and political process, and the last 4 years are fairly good evidence of that. So one key step is we need to demand much greater transparency around corporate lobbying. That may be a good step on the way to reducing or eliminating corporate money in the political process altogether. So in my view, the most important thing we can do right now to encourage corporate action on climate is vote, vote, vote. If you look at the Biden-Harris ticket, it's an amazingly detailed, in-depth, smart roadmap for a cleaner and greener future. If the Biden-Harris ticket is elected, we will move aggressively toward a more climate-friendly set of policies in the US. If they're not elected, we will continue to go backwards. So I think that's the single most important thing we can do to support collective action by the business sector on climate.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That's very interesting. I'll definitely be looking at that paper. So building off some of these insights in terms of publicly traded or privately traded, differences in corporate or in public policy affecting corporate action, Ian, what are some of the most interesting corporate innovations related to climate change, and how do we scale them up to address this global challenge?
Thank you, Abigail, where everyone can hear me.
Oh, no. Hey.
Can you hear me? Yes? Be good?
Yes.
Great, okay.
Yeah.
Just a bit of context. I am no social scientist, but what I can hope I can add today is a little bit of context of some of the interesting things that I'm seeing companies doing and why I think they're able to do them. I was just looking through the last few weeks, big events and big announcements that we've seen. I mean, I've been very impressed by big tech. Now, love them or loathe them, big tech really seems to be engaging on carbon neutrality. I mean, we've had Google announcing it's going to offset all its carbon emissions since 1998 on the way to getting carbon neutral. Facebook, 100% renewable energy from this year, and its entire value chain with renewable energy by 2030. Microsoft carbon negative by 2030. Apple carbon neutral by 2030 to include lifestyle emissions of all its products. So these are big targets and challenges for these businesses. I know they're doing it through just using smarter use of technology, huge investment in renewable energy, but they're nailing their colours very, very clearly to the mass. And it's not just big tech. Just last week we saw Smithfield Foods, based in Virginia in the US, massive protein business. It's collecting to be carbon neutral in all its US operations by 2030. And again, it's used as just smarter efficiencies in fertilizers, for example, in better soil practices, and again, massive investment in renewable energy. So these are really big companies making big targets towards really dealing with their environmental impact and their climate change risks. So why is it that these are coming about? Well, it really strikes me that what I'm seeing is people, businesses in particular, much better at engaging on their tier 3 supply chain emissions. Dealing with tier 1 and tier 2 are pretty straightforward, but tier 3 is where the massive impacts are, and businesses really now seem to be finally getting to grips with them. Long way to go, of course, but there is now definite movement towards this. What are the ways to go about this? Well, businesses need to use the tools that are there. I mean, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, from the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development gives a very good starting point for businesses who want to engage in these things. Businesses need to know, of course, that data accuracy is essential. You've got to get it right. You've got to measure the right thing to be able to take all this forward to deal with your impact. And there are lots of tools available to do that. Get the cost analysis right. Got to make sure that your CFO agrees with you that there is a business benefit to doing this. And again, lots of tools and processes you can go through that will help you in that respect. But for me, the really big one has been the development of the Science-Based Targets Initiative from the CDP, from the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. Really big game changer when companies can really plot what they have to do their part in the collective movement towards dealing with meeting the Paris Agreement protocol targets. Already 510 companies have approved science-based targets. Another 460 are developing science-based targets. And interestingly enough, last week announcement that new standards being developed to help companies use science-based targets to get their corporate goals correct. I don't know how much time we've got, but one thing I thought interesting to talk about is the collaboration side of things. That's been the big problem for many sectors in supply chains for a number of years. I think that the Cocoa in the Forests initiative in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which is a public-private partnership set up a couple of years ago, involving both governments, but also involving the private sector, local NGOs, local community groups, with the aim of ending deforestation and the related climate impact from the cocoa sector, and to then restore forests. At the same time, it's been a way of making sure that the security of supply is there for buyers for the long term. And it's been slow progress, but it does show what can be done within a sector if you're willing to bring all the actors together. It's slow progress, but it definitely shows what can be done. Abigail, how much time have we got? Do you want to run? I should run out of time. I've got more things you can perhaps come back to if you wish.
Yeah, I think let's come back. Actually, this is a nice transition to Ben. So we'll go to Ben and Cassie. Can you hear us? No? Oh dear. Okay. We'll go back to Cassie after Ben. But okay, so Ben, who's working on supply chains, I think this is a wonderful and decision science and using science for decision making or decision support tools. So with Fusion, you've looked at the underlying foundation, sustainability of America's supply chains in terms of food, energy, water systems. What do you think some of the tough choices and opportunities for change are in the upcoming decades for the corporate sector? And what role do you see decision tools, support, data playing in that decision-making process?
Yeah, I want to emphasize or reinforce what Ian just said. Data is a key here. We're talking about improving based on environmental performance benchmarks, and that requires high quality data. It also requires that you make a business case for it to your customers in many cases, and that requires visualized, simplified data. And so we need high quality visual data. There's also risk management. So our definitions of risk keep expanding. When we're globalizing our supply chains, we're also globalizing our risk profile. And so we have to understand what that means. We've been introducing in the globalization era, massive risk into our supply chains by pushing them across national borders, but we haven't been taking into account how that affects our business operations very well. We need to get better at that, and this also involves measuring our supply chains, measuring risk and resilience in our supply chains. It comes back to data, comes back to analytics. The problem with international supply chains and global supply chains, the big problem, I believe, is that it creates a lot of invisible systems. We don't see what's going on in this massive web of supply chains. There's concentrations of risk, there's environmental hotspots, and there's things we don't really know about. There's things our suppliers are doing. The solution or the opportunity then is better data, better transparency, and the ability to see what's going on in the supply chains, to simplify that complexity, to see the risk, and to then start managing it. So globalization's been a great thing in many ways for business. It's been a great thing for resilience too. We've studied food supply chain resilience, and it turns out that the modern food supply chain is far more resilient than the one it replaced pre-globalization because of all those connections and the ability for people to source food from around the world. It's a great thing. It also lowers costs, but it introduces dependencies. Do you know what those are? So this backlash, I also want to point out something that's coming. If you haven't seen it coming already, supply chain regulation is coming. Post-COVID, and also in the US-China trade war, these are triggering events that are going to cause supply chain regulation to start kicking in some countries. Particularly, this is going to start with lifeline supply chains that are crossing national borders. For example, pharmaceuticals, energy, food, key raw materials. These things are going to start becoming a focus for national security regulators. Your businesses are going to need to respond to that. You're going to need to balance your national self-sufficiency in critical lifelines with your corporate objectives. So prepare for that regulatory risk. It's coming. We also have growing environmental risks, right? It used to just be tropical deforestation. Now it's a huge array. We've got water stress, we've got e-waste, we've got plastics, overfishing, land use, all of these risks. Water use is the big one. Water, that's the 800-pound gorilla in the supply chain. And that is coming at us fast now, slower before, now faster. I dropped the paper into the chat window on water risk in the supply chain. For example, it turns out that when you map out the supply chains with tools like we've built, like with the Fusion project, you can see that there's hotspots. In the Western US, most of the water stress in the supply chain, most of the water resource risk in the Western US, which is one of the world's great water stress hotspots, is concentrated in the beef and dairy supply chain, and specifically in the alfalfa production sector. If we can solve that one area of risk, for example, with economically beneficial rotational fallowing programs, we can knock out this huge environmental problem. The companies that are positioned to do this in most cases are large companies that are sitting fairly far downstream in the supply chain that have really concentrated purchasing power. They're the ones sitting in between the consumers and the primary producers. And they're the ones that need to start mapping this data and taking concentrated action.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. So I think Cassandra is on, and yes, you're okay, great. So Cassandra has been involved in developing a number of decision support tools, and I'd love to learn more about, so corporate action does not occur in a vacuum. What role do government and non-governmental organizations play at different levels in facilitating adaptation to larger scales with many corporate actors? And some of these tools that you've helped to develop, what role do you see those in helping collective action occur? Oh, no. Oh, no. Let's see. Darn. Okay, so we'll come back to Cassandra because I don't know. We're all having challenges in this virtual world. So, okay. Yes. Oh, I heard you, I think.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Oh,
do you remember the question?
I do. Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for bearing with this. Anyway, yeah. So I work a lot with local governments in dealing with understanding the impacts of climate change, and most importantly, adapting to those impacts. And I think the question you asked is really a great one because it gets at one of those core challenges that local governments face in adaptation, which is that because climate impacts are generally local, I think there's often a kind of assumption that equates to the fact that it means local government or government in general is solely responsible for managing those impacts. But if you start looking into the economics of adaptation, really the benefits accrue primarily to the private sector, in terms of, and this is of action that governments would take or lead or coordinate to reduce impacts of climate change in a community or whatever the case may be, where that those adaptation actions do things like preserve property values, maintain critical infrastructure services like transportation, energy, so on, that all of us, residents, businesses, and the like, rely on to go throughout our day, do our job, kind of earn our livings and so on. So really, if there's this challenge from the local government standpoint, is trying to figure out how can we involve the private sector in these adaptation solutions. And I think the main role for the public sector and the nonprofit sector is in continuing to have those conversations and coordinating with the business community and private sector to figure out, how, number one, solving the question, how do we as a society pay for all of this? What are some creative mechanisms to leverage private dollars to things that are accruing to private benefit, for example? Sometimes that looks like public-private partnerships or transfer of development rights or special assessment districts. There's a lot of different approaches people are using where, again, local government and the business sector are coming together to try to fund these issues. And the other, so sort of that's aside, kind of a role of local government in helping sort of having the private sector and local government kind of work together towards these bigger adaptation solutions. And then separately, I think there's also a role for kind of the public sector and nonprofit sector in helping, provide data and information to the private sector in terms of helping them understand the risks and manage the risks, to their core business.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cassandra. Tom, could I go back to you? So I was hoping we could connect more deeply with some of the decision science work. And so one of our new assistant professors, Caitlin Drummond, was an herb postdoc in the Herb Institute at University of Michigan, which connected us with you and with Ian. And so I'd like to hear your take on some of the decision science, this idea of norms or narratives of, what's shaping some of the corporate decision making right now.
Yeah, happy to think about that. I'm not a decision scientist, so I'm not an advisor. So that's not really how I approach things, but I do think corporations have a really important role to play in creating norms. So Ian was talking about these big investments that many of the big tech companies are making in renewables. And I don't want to downplay those, but I do think they may have a strategic business motive, which is, let me see if I can get out from under paying for the overhead costs of my electric utility by privatizing my own electric supply. So I'm not really sure that creates a norm that should be universally adopted. But leave that aside. The other norm that I think we really need to create is a new norm around business engagement in politics. And we're starting to see a lot of companies stepping up and advocating for sensible climate policy. Many of you will be familiar with Ceres, which is an organization that has long had a group of companies that engage in bipartisan advocacy for climate policy. I think those guys set a wonderful example, and there are a lot of companies that have signed on and been part of that effort. We're also starting to see some companies creating a new norm of transparency around their political engagement. And I think that's going to become increasingly important. Congress has very little incentive to be transparent about its own behavior. And so this is one of those areas where we may have to look for the private sector to do it. And there have been a whole series of business initiatives the last few years. The We Are Still In initiative is just one example, where companies are creating a new norm of engaging together to stand up for taking climate seriously. So I think there are a lot of ways that companies are usefully stepping up to try to create new and better norms in the climate space.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. So we have a great audience question that I wanted to go to now. I'd like Ian and both comment on private sector collective action in terms of like best performance or what you see working. I don't know. Why don't we start with Ian?
Sorry, what was the question precisely? What private sector collaboration I'm seeing working?
So the private sector performance and collective action, sort of best cases that you've seen where private sector actors have come together and collectively acted.
Well, I do think that the one I highlighted, the cocoa sector example in West Africa, I know it does have its detractors, but I think it's an example where it's multi-stakeholder. I mean, I do think that it has to be. This comes back to the point that Tom made right at the beginning. You do have to get. It's got to be collaboration that work. You have to have an engagement between companies and business. And I mean, I'm seeing ever more the examples of companies as agitators. I mean, Unilever is the prime example that people always come back to, and it's been doing this for some time, and its Sustainable Living Plan is already 10 years old. But just this week, or last week rather, it announced a new €1 billion level of investment to eliminate fossil fuels from cleaning products by 2030. So it's a lot of that sort of, again, another corporate commitment. And to come back on Tom's point around, the tech sector isn't creating any new norms. Well, yeah, I accept that, but we've got to, if in the basis of, or in the process of not creating new norms, they still are eliminating mass amounts of emissions, that's what we need if we're going to reach the targets that we need to for the Paris Accord. So, yeah, I mean, I am no great fan of those companies, but I shrug my shoulders and say, well, this is great. They are actually engaging on environmental issues, whether it's for their own business, for their own business means or not. It's the sum total will be for the benefit of us all. Another big business, actually, we talked a bit about water. If you want a couple of examples of developments on water, there was a CDP brought out a report into the fashion sector's water use, which I recommend people to look at. And basically they say the fashion sector isn't engaging in its water. I mean, agricultural water use is being, we've talked about already, but the fashion sector is one that I think is going to come into quite a lot of criticism for its water use across its supply chain. There are lots of risks right across its supply chain, from runoff from fields, from fixing and dyeing in factories, from then microfiber plastic pollution from consumer use. And also interesting recently was Cargill, their new water targets. Look, Google them. They're quite stretching. And then another business that's turned itself around in terms of its approach to all of its sustainability impacts. It's been talking about water use now as well. So rambling, not sort of answer to your question, but I hope that's useful.
Well, no, I think that's right. Like your exemplar cases, these are in really important industries. So Cassandra, did you want to take this? I was thinking, particularly with your local experience, have you seen collective action in terms of the corporate sector at local levels?
Yeah, I was just going to add, so the first thing that comes to mind is, so I'm based in Miami, Florida, so there's a lot of, obviously, climate risk here and in South Florida, and I would say you do see a lot of engagement from kind of the business community here through, and where like the local chambers of commerce are very heavily engaged in discussions around long-term climate planning, and in many cases, really pushing the governments to do more, be better, to really take action, and that those are kind of coalitions that include, everything from small businesses to multinational corporations that are based here, who kind of recognize the need for adaptation, for long-term sustainability in these places and cities where we live and work, and again, engaging, both pushing their governments, but also kind of cooperating and working with them and figuring out what they can do as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cassandra. So, Ben, so this is a little bit tricky, but we're getting some ethics and justice and other considerations coming up here. From your perspective, coming at it with the sort of data and science, how do we integrate some of those into support tools and data and what's being provided for decision makers in the private sector?
This is always a hard problem. Big problems aren't technical, although the technical problems are there. The big problem is incentives. We have counter incentives that prevent data sharing. We have costs involved in organizing data, collecting data, sharing data. There's also both national security problems and regulations, along with customer data privacy regulations and problems to think about, in addition to corporations' own self-interest in keeping some of that information close to the vest. So I think it's actually the privacy problem that's the key problem to the information technology, to the data science, right? We need to overcome the privacy problem. This calls for industry consortia that bring together technologies that allow you to share your own supply chain data in ways that don't reveal key details, while still making the whole collective a pile of data accessible for research and accessible for analytics. So there's some nuance and sophistication that's required there. Importantly, I also think that this involves, or should involve, a partnership between large companies and local, regional, national governments to do the same, because your city supply chains, your national supply chains that those regulators are trying to secure and are trying to more importantly, I keep using the word security because I think that the bigger push here in coming years is actually going to be a security push, not an environmental regulation or environmental management push. But both are there, both security and supply chains and environmental footprints. Large companies and cities and national governments are in this together. Cities and national governments have supply chains that are comprised of corporate supply chains. And so you have to bring those two interests together as well in the data science and the visualization. It requires that partnership as well. It's very hard to do from the top down, though. I really think that large business needs to take the lead on this to create supply chain data technologies and sharing. And there's some examples of that happening on a limited basis.
Okay, great. So thank you all for taking time here today, and thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and a very active audience. I appreciate the chat that's been ongoing. So the real sort of key central point we were hoping to engage with during this panel was this idea that decision and social sciences have not fully engaged with the corporate sector. And I think, as our panelists have talked about, there's many ways that these spaces, as well as broader sort of decision support, decision science, and can come together to help to provide information for corporate actors. But additionally, it's not just about corporate action in that sense. As Tom Line was pointing out, it's really important that we think about the policies and, you know, also the bottom line. I mean, to motivate action is going to take multi-level, cross-scale action, but corporate actors are critically important. So for those of us that are in the academy and at various universities, I think we need to step down from the ivory tower more and to provide necessary information and science, decision support tools, data, strategies to catalyze collective action. And I just want to say that I've learned a lot. There's a lot of wonderful papers that have been posted in the chat today, and I really appreciate your time that you've taken, panelists. So now I wanted to end with just a quote from my PhD advisor, was the Nobel Memorial Prize winner, Eleanor Ostrom. And she used to end all of these sort of big meetings saying, you know, she'd love to say, let's get to work. So I think that's where we need to go, is we all need to come together to collectively act, the business sector, academia, and NGOs. So thank you so much for your time. It has been a delightful morning for me. Thank you.